Okay, we're back. Uh, we're going to continue with that lecture because they're supposed to be continuous, but I just cut the two into separate segments. So we were discussing about the colonial legacy, and one question that you might have at the back of your minds is, what is the role of our local politicians in all of these? What kind of uh, role did our local principalia play to make all of these extractive plundering activities possible? And I think the title of our presentation, which is inspired by the work of Timario Rivera and Roland Simbulan, uh, already tells us a clue about the role of politicians in this kind of economic arrangements, which created rural underdevelopment and landlessness, social unrest, poverty, Duterte for that matter. When your landlords are also your capitalists and politicians. No? That's the title of our presentation. And I'm talking about the period right after the war when supposedly we were granted independence by our colonial ruler, which is the US. Um, I'm implicitly using actually a kind of economic model of development uh, derived from political economy, and according to one of its uh, brightest thinkers, no, economies develop according to certain stages because they're trying to respond to the problem of scarcity. Let's be philosophical about it. No, if we were to be using the ideas of Marx, uh, economic development is supposedly progressive because man finds himself in a historical situation of scarcity. That has always been the situation of man. Everything that he needs materially, he needs to use his intellect and labor power to achieve his needs, no? To acquire his needs. And it has always been a struggle against the environment. But over time, history has made it possible for man to find ways to create arrangements economically, socioculturally, technologically to resolve this problem of scarcity. How did man do this? No? By using his intellect and his labor power, and then creating social arrangements that would harness this new power. No? That's has been the history of man ever since. So that's a story of man from the primitive era, and then he changed to the um, feudalistic era, and then to the industrial revolution and capitalism, and then onwards to socialism and then to communism. All of these economic stages are there or are taking place because what man is trying to resolve is the problem of scarcity for one and all, not just for a particular class. That supposedly is greatest discovery, the end of capitalism, to realize that we cannot go on living following a class system. What we need to do is to establish a social order that would finally resolve the problem of scarcity for one and all. So we're actually using that implicitly when we were talking about Ode Corpus, and now when we're discussing Timario Rivera and Roland Simbulan. Timario Rivera is a lot more Marxist in his approach, and I think that's very obvious as he's talking about class formations in the post-war era and why it did not happen. No? You see, economic development is driven by the contradictions between classes, which have within them the logic of certain economic social arrangements. No? The feudal monarchy had to be replaced by the modern republic because the logic of the new economy resided in autonomous individuals who are capable of selling their labor power to the highest bidder, okay, which is your wage labor. You know? And at some point, people are supposedly going to realize that working for another class is not just unjust, but economically unfeasible. At some point, we must do away with the class system and resolve the problem of scarcity by the redistribution of resources made out of collective labor power. Okay? Now, that same kind of model has been used by political economists in trying to figure out the changes taking place in Western European societies and in the new colonies such as the Philippines. No? The classical Marxist model is that there's a clean break between feudalism to capitalism caused by the contradiction between the feudal monarchy and the capitalist class, which wanted to give birth to the modern republic or the liberal democratic project. So you may say, so you think it's fit to refer to it that way. The case is different, however, in new colonies such as the Philippines, and I think this is what Timaro Rivera is trying to drive at. No? There hasn't been a revolutionary break, unlike what happened between the Bolsheviks and the Russian aristocrats or in the French Revolution. No, neither has there been a break between the feudal landed class and the capitalist class as it happened in the Americas, no? Or in the United States of America. What happened instead was a distortion in the process of economic development because of the effects of and demands of the colonial economy sutured into the local economy. The extractive process had a lot of consequences, not just in terms of stunting the economy, but also in giving rise to certain political arrangements that made possible this cycle of underdevelopment operating almost perpetually, unchanging. And that's a sad story of the Philippines, actually. Let's go to the nitty-gritty of how Timaro Rivera arrived at this conclusion. Well, what Dr. Timaro Rivera was trying to decipher was the different class formations at the important stage in Philippine economic history. Because if you were to follow the classical model of development, at some point, given the growing population, local industries should be able to diversify and enter into manufacturing so that it would feed into the needs of the local economy. But that did not happen in the Philippines. Why? He studied the different class formations. He identified three. You had the landed class, was also into manufacturing. Then you have the non-landed class, who was purely into manufacturing. And then you had the Chinese Filipinos. No? They're essentially all of them are drawn from landlords and the merchant capitalists. No? But it is the landed segment which dominated the import substituting sector, particularly in its formative years. No? And just to give an idea of who these people are, and this is something I find very interesting too. Who are the non-landed capitalists in the country between 1950 to 1986? No? And these are familiar names to many of us, like the Alcantaras. He sits as the Secretary of Finance right now. No? And they used to own Iligan Cement. Alsons, no? They're also into that. No? Then what other familiar names are here are the Conceptions, no? Who are behind the Carrier or the air conditioning company. So these are non-landed capitalists. Consunhi, who are also into cement. And you had the Enriles, who transformed their political power into economic. He was Marcos' crony for the longest time, Marcos' defense minister. And for sure, he enjoyed many of the perks by being a crony. These are examples of your non-landed capitalists. No? For instance, you had here Silverio is a Marcos crony who owned Delta Motors. And what is Delta Motors but the local subsidiary of Toyota? And they created the Mini Cruiser, which is only available in the country, a smaller version of the Toyota Land Cruiser. But that was because Marcos wanted a local production of military vehicles. So it's also done at the behest of the dictatorship during that time. Then you had the Chinese Filipinos. Who are these? Now these are also familiar names to us even to this day, like the Campos. The Campos owns Unilab, so they manufactured pharmaceuticals, and they were very successful at it because even up to now they're still producing uh, medicines and vitamins and other pharma products, no? But they have diversified actually and gone into the food business, particularly sauces, no? So they own NutriAsia, and under NutriAsia, or I don't know, part of the Campos group of companies also large-scale agricultural plantations such as Del Monte, which is located in Bukidnon. So these are the Chinese Filipinos who are into manufacturing. Who are these? The Campos, the Gokongways, no, who owns Universal Robina, Universal Motors, Pacific Mills, La Tondenia, and I think the Antonio T. I don't know, I'm not familiar, I'm not so sure anymore, but the one who owns Emperador, they should probably belong to this, no? These are examples of the landed or the non-landed Filipinos, but this particular list identifies the Chinese Filipinos, no? And then finally you have the landed capitalist class, who Temario identifies as the leading segment of the import substitution stage in the 1950s. And who are these? Aboitiz, Araneta, Ayala, Coanco, Garcia, Coanco, Elizalde, De Leon. Why are they so familiar? No? Some of these names from the 1950s are not anymore, but these landed capitalists are so familiar even in the 20th 20 years after the turn of the century. Why are they still so very familiar? Ayala, Aboitiz, no? Alcantara, sorry, the landed capitalist class, Coanco, Elizalde. Because your landlord were also capitalists, many of these also became prominent politicians, like the Coancos. The Elizaldes were very much related, or was part of the Marcos cabinet, if I'm not mistaken. Aranetas, too. No? These are your landlords who also happen to be capitalists. Why is this an issue? This is probably a slide that should have been later, but why is this an issue? Well, for Temario Rivera, if you have the landed class also playing a very prominent role in your manufacturing sector, this indicates contradictory economic interests. They have continuing ties to land in other primary industries like logging and mining. They brought contradictory interests into the import substitution stage that undercut their commitment to manufacturing. And that has something to do with foreign linkages. No? You can imagine the landed capitalist class, who is the dominant class, more than the merchant Filipino Chinese class and the non-landed class. So Temario Rivera identifies as playing a bigger role in the economy. And they have contradictory economic interests because they have both feet on both the production of raw materials and the manufacturing of goods. And they have both feet in the two because they have foreign partners who they partner with. Like for instance, now this is an example. Ayala, what is their product? Pure Foods, no? But Pure Foods is partly owned by the American company Hormel, no? So it is not within the interest of Ayala to take away their partnership with Hormel, because under this arrangement they're already earning super profits. Why should they fight against Hormel, which is their partner ever since the turn of the century when the Americans came over and started buying Batangas beef produced by the Americans, by the Ayalas, okay? Therefore, even even though there's a market for corned beef, and that market can be provided for by uh, local products using local raw materials. Uh, there's no clean break between Pure Foods and Hormel. They have no reason to fight against each other and corner a bigger share of the market, because under this arrangement, the Ayalas are already earning profit. So why the hell do they need to reinvent the wheel? Okay, and that goes as well for many other landed capitalists who are both into manufacturing and into production of raw materials. No? They're happy producing raw materials for their foreign partners, who in turn give back the products locally, and they earn twice under this arrangement. No? The local principalia like the Ayalas earn twice under this arrangement. They sell their raw materials cheap, uh, of course, because of the cheap labor of the local peasant class tending over their uh, cows and their cattle. Then they stamp it with the imprimatur of the Hormel, because Hormel will provide them with the technology to can the Batangas beef. And then they sell it to the local market. They did not fight with their colonial masters or their American business partners under this regard, no, because they enjoy. So that's a problem. The ideal process is for national bourgeoisie to fight against these foreign influence, foreign finance, local companies, so that money, the profit under that operation will go back to the local economy. But our local principalia and our landed capitalists are happy extracting profit from both ends of the candle, so to speak. And who is the candle? The Filipino people, the landless peasant on one hand, and those who will buy their canned beef, uh, given the markup that they place in that product. So, for Timana Rivera, during this important phase of the country's economy, where we're supposed to develop industries, we failed to do so because our landed capitalist class also had contradictory economic interests uh, with the with the with the landed with agricultural production. No? Another consequence of this was the failure of land reform to take place, because your landlords are also your politicians. Ever since the time of the Katipunan Revolution, land reform was already the call. And that continued even during the American colonial government, during the time of the Japanese occupation with the Hukbalahap, and even during the time of Magsaysay. The challenge has always been to democratize Philippine society by democratizing the economy. And how are you supposed to do that? No? By steering up local capital, by parceling the land off to the tiller. Okay, but that did not happen because who are your landlords? They're also your politicians, and they're also your capitalists. No? So that's the problem about having of achieving a relatively autonomous developmentalist state. We failed to achieve that because our political systems are captured by the same landlords, or also capitalists who are also politicians. No? And I'm moving on to the work of Roland Simbulan here by discussing to you the modern principalia, no? The one I'm talking about. They are our socioeconomic elite. They trace their roots from their affinity with the colonial powers. Their opportunistic behavior and have doubtful loyalties. Their loyalties to their family. No? And they're opportunistic because the cycle of political survival demands from that they extract as much as possible from their positions as politicians in order to feed into their land holding and manufacturing interests. No? And they currently occupy positions of political power. Where did they come from? Where did these local principalia come from? They are the conduits between the colonial powers and the local peasant class. They're the ones who made possible the extractive practices of our colonial rulers by fronting for their interests. No? They are Spaniards or Chinese merchants who intermarried with the local population who created a mestizo class. And these are your Castilaloy in different small municipalities, and they are differentiated from the bulk of the people not only because of their physical features but also because of their outlook, their socio-economic position, and their dominant political roles. No? This group became highly Hispanized and later Americanized, send their children to American universities or to UP, Ateneo, LaSalle, and that's it. No, where do they get their cultural logic? No, where do they come from? The boss rule established by the Americans, no, or caciquism, no, your patriarch, your patronage system, which was distorted from the Datu system. Uh, I always tell this in my class. The Dato used to be the protector of the community, no? But when the Spaniards came in and started to apportion land, the Dato realized that he can use this social capital for his own private gain. At the same time, seeking grace from his new colonial masters, which is the Spaniards. No? Under this arrangement, the Dato did not anymore take care of the interests of the community, but only took care of his own. And that's how the whole system of debt peonage comes from. No? You have the landlord class fronting for the haciendero, the Catholic hierarchy, the Spanish colonial government. And below the landlord class are your kasama, or in Bisaya we call that as your saup. The landlord class, of course, is your agalon. That is the kind of economic system that the Spaniards established, and that became the economic base of present day Philippine society. If you talk about the patronage and feudal systems that make it possible for your landlord and capitalist to also become your politicians. Because power is so concentrated, both political and economic, to this particular class. In order to survive, the peasant class would need to abide by the demands of the local political class. Always. No? Because the local political class provides for their need. Hospitalization, utang sa tindahan, the land where their house stands on, the whole idea of the sakada. No? That's an example pushed to the extreme. But that is true for many Filipinos, especially in the rural areas. No? Debt peonage is a system where you are indebted to your landlord because of unfair arrangements in terms of how to divide the harvests. You know? And the debt becomes a generational thing. And you're landless now, your children will still be landless. Okay? That's how the Spaniards did it. The Americans maintained this. Why? Because they were extracting from the same agricultural enterprises that the Spaniards established and even expanded it by, for instance, let's just talk about Del Monte and what's that other, Dole. No? These are formerly American companies, and by virtue of declaring public land as American land, no? They granted plantations for American companies to operate in South Cotabato and Bukidnon. That's the genesis of Del Monte and Dole. They like this system. They only need to talk to one landlord instead of talking to many small peasant farmers for their products and their goods. On the other hand, landowners take advantage of this cheap and abundant labor. No? Large-scale farming is also capital intensive, and this is something that they the only ones that can do this. The small farmers cannot do this. They cannot mechanize. No? Easier to deal with peasants instead of workers, small parcels of land. It's a carryover of the Spanish time. Yes, culturally, why do they remain in power? Because of the utang na loob system. You elect your mayor because si mayor nang hatag og pang-hajj, or si mayor nang hatag og ayuda sa panahon sa pandemya, even though all of these come from the people's taxes. Okay? And given the system, it's easy to translate this economic power into political power and then back again. How do they do this? Through guns, goons, and gold, division of spoils. So you have here a politician in the Senate or in Congress fighting over pork. Let us not mention names, but you know how a particular senator is acting as if taxpayers' money is his to give around. It's all a formula for corruption, actually. So, you had here an economic system established by colonial past, which gave rise to a political system which benefits that economic system. How does that continue? How does that evil machinery continue? Because the logic of the political system is to maintain that kind of cycle. And what is that logic that makes it possible for them to continue in perpetuity? We call that as bureaucrat capitalism. Power is so concentrated at the center, both locally and nationally. You have your local warlords, then you have somebody like Duterte, who is really a national warlord more than anything else. No one's questioning them because they have the full arsenal of the state to protect their interests. It's easy to label others as terrorists, those who are challenging the state. But your state is run by bureaucrat capitalists. They are politicians who use their power for their private economic gain. And that's because your landlords, your capitalists are also your politicians. That's the kind of problem that we are mired in. It's an evil machine that perpetuates its operations, because that's the logic of the economic order upon which all this political system and practices rests. It's a sad story, but also a fascinating one. And the question that you should have in our minds right now is, how do we end this cycle? How do we stop this evil machine? That's a question we'll answer in the end of the semester. So think about it right now. Given this weight of history behind us, and given the cycle of bureaucrat capitalism constantly feeding into this economic system that benefits only a few at the expense of many, many poor Filipinos, how do we stop this? Food for thought. So thank you for listening, and I hope you'll be able to pass meaningful and substantive reflections. Try to, tie your own personal narrative to these concepts. Like, I'm talking about corruption from a very abstract perspective, but how did you experience corruption personally or your family? How does it affect you and your future and your children's future? That's one way to go about writing your summary papers. Again, thank you, and I hope you enjoyed our lectures for today.